So recently I watched the film The Last King of Scotland, which is a semi-fictional portrayal of Idi Amin of Uganda, who is widely regarded as one of the most brutal dictators of the second half of the 20th century. Um, I've just watched a rant with Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. So I've been thinking of the subject of African dictators, specifically African dictators. Of course, you could find strong men and authoritarian figures in other continents, but I'm focusing on Africa here because I want to focus on a particular issue, and that is the relationship between Pan-Africanism and authoritarian regimes, or more specifically, I should say, the relationship between Pan-Africanism and its excuses for authoritarian regimes. Now, firstly, this is a magazine that I occasionally buy, the New African. Its lead item, this is from July. Its lead item is on Boko Haram and Nigeria. But each month it covers a different issue. It's obviously focusing on African stories, the continent of Africa. Um, I have taken issue with that magazine a few times because I believe that it takes a very hardline Pan-Africanist stance, and really it's a bit like RT in the sense it doesn't seem to have much objectivity in terms of its reporting of Europe and Britain. Um, okay, I'm going to start from an angle here, which is basically on perspective, because I can absolutely guarantee and predict that there will be many people watching this, maybe from the continent of Africa, and this is something I believe is very important to stress, the continent of Africa, um, who will not like what I'm saying and who will take the view, you're a privileged white man from a rich country. Well, first is a basic fact. We are who we are. We cannot change where we are born or who we are. Um, I'm not going to apologize for being British. I'm not going to apologize for being a white guy. Um, I have responsibility to acknowledge my country's past, and I believe everyone in the world has a responsibility to be honest about his or her country's past. Now, I am objective and open-minded enough to absolutely admit that there were many, many things done in the name of the British Empire, especially, as we were the largest empire, that were reprehensible. And I absolutely acknowledge that empire and the concept of imperialism was built both on exploitation and, in many circumstances, racism. This is indisputable. Um, I believe there were some positive aspects of empire as well, in terms of promoting British concept of government, such as the Westminster model and other aspects. So I don't believe it was entirely bad. But I am stressing the point that I am not one of these people that is sort of like, oh, we were all good, and I'm not here basically to be an apologist for our colonial past. I have no interest in doing that. However, I do remain somewhat skeptical of some of the roles that Pan-Africanists today play. Africa today is a continent of 56 countries, 57 actually, including South Sudan. Um, and it's a very, very diverse continent. And the thing is, I think it's a bit phony. I think that the reason I resent the Pan-Africanist mentality is because there's sort of this arrogant assumption that they speak for all Africans. Now, I don't speak for Africans clearly because I'm not an African, but I would question what makes those who would identify themselves as Pan-Africanist um, assume that they speak for all Africans. This is a continent, not a country, as people will be very keen to point out. Um, and there is a very great deal of diversity in terms of culture, in terms of language, even in terms of politics. And whilst there can be certain trends found in Africa or certain generic problems in terms of issues connected to government, it is still a continent. It's as diverse as any other continent, and that's something that we cannot lose sight of. So when publications like New African um, say things like Africans don't like this, Africans don't like that, that is as absurd as saying Europeans don't like this, Europeans don't like that, or Asians don't like this, Asians don't like that. New African, in my opinion, takes a sort of stance, and it's based on London, incredibly. For a magazine that is so hostile to the United Kingdom, it's based in London. It isn't based in Nairobi or Dar es Salaam or Lagos. It's based in London, which, to my reckoning, makes them somewhat hypocritical. If they're going to take such an anti-British editorial stance so much of the time, um, why be based in the country that they so deeply resent? I do think there is a lack of objectivity in their coverage. I'm not saying it's entirely bad, but I do see a very strong bias. Um, but with the Pan-Africanist issue that I want to talk about again, firstly, I'm not ignorant of history. I have done quite a lot of research into this, and it's quite clear that what we saw was during the post-colonial period, from about the 1950s to the 1980s, you had this decolonization process from former African colonies getting their independence from countries like the United Kingdom, France, Portugal, and Belgium, and in many circumstances, those resulted in bloody colonial wars, and then subsequently even bloodier civil wars. Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau are examples of the situation from Portugal. Of course, African countries played a very important role in the Cold War, but unfortunately, they often bore the brunt of it between this chess game between the superpowers. Um, Africa today, again, really there's two Africas. There's the positive Africa and the negative Africa. Well, there's more Africas, in fact, but very often the image of Africa is famine, war, corruption, all these negative things. And I know a lot of African people resent that, and understandably so. However, there is an inconsistency because then um, people will say things like, when problems do arise, there would then be a contention, oh, well, people don't care because we're just Africans. So there is a lot of inconsistency in what, in my opinion, is not a black and white issue. This is contemporary Africa is not a black and white issue, and I don't think you could describe it as such. This continent is the cradle of civilization, so it's always, always, always going to have a special role in the human psyche. Anyway, I don't want to go too far off track. Like I said at the start of the video, I want to speak about the issue of Pan-Africanism and authoritarian regimes. One thing that I have noticed is that Pan-Africanists seem to go out of their way to make excuses for dictators. People who really, Idi Amin is a good example, but he's not the only example. There is Robert Mugabe. There is other characters like so-called Emperor Picasso, and there's others. Colonel Gaddafi to some extent, although I'm wary about North Africa because that's getting into Arab influence. But basically, both in sub-Saharan Africa and in North Africa, there is a tendency for a lot of people to go out of their way to make excuses for these dictators. Now, I refuse to believe that this is because the average person from these countries are desensitized. I'm saying these countries because I am talking about more than one country. Um, I don't believe there is any difference between Africans and the rest of the world in terms of basic humanity. I believe, like any other part of the world, you get good Africans and bad Africans. I'm talking about a continent here of 1.1 billion people, and I keep coming back to this point. But if you type in a video about Robert Mugabe or about Idi Amin, I guarantee you will come across a lot of people trying to make excuses for them. And these ultimately are men who are almost beyond redemption. Um, You can say it's demonization, but the problem is they've done such a good job, have done such a good job of demonizing themselves through their antics, through their selfish behavior. Let's take Zimbabwe as an example. Um, Under Robert Mugabe, Zimbabwe has become effectively a failed state. It's got some of the highest inflation in the world. There's severe human rights abuses. Dissidents are routinely harassed. Journalists are beaten up. Um, it's faced severe food shortages on numerous occasions. All of this has happened on Mugabe's watch. This is just a basic fact. Now, not long ago, he celebrated his 90th birthday, and he celebrated that in a very lavish style. This is whilst his people are living in dire poverty. Now, call me what you will, but that is clearly inconsistent to praise a man who has such a terrible track record in Zimbabwe. And I take the view that this has come from a sort of a personality cult, because when you get the likes of Mugabe, who in their early days were known as anti-colonial figures, in those days they were understandably admired by a lot of people. But the problem is they use that as a way to basically cover up everything else they've done. Now, the fact of the matter is, some of the things that Robert Mugabe has done is unforgivable. Um, so trying to sort of amalgamate his role in the anti-colonial struggle with his role as president is something that I think Pan-Africanists do in order to make excuses for him. Now, if it was a case that they were a bit more objective and they said, we admire Robert Mugabe for his role in the anti-colonialist struggle, however, we acknowledge that he has done some terrible things as president, then I'd say, okay, fair enough. But instead, it's just this groveling personality cult, and that's something that makes me very uncomfortable. And frankly, I think those people, in the case of people who have no choice, I'm not going to criticize them. But for those who are in a position of privilege, who are educated, who have traveled, I say shame on you. Shame on you for defending a man whose greed and ego and selfishness has led this country to be a failed state. I mean, it may be marginally better than it was 8 years ago, but fact of the matter is, um, African government is not benefiting from the image of strongman leaders like Muammar Gaddafi and Robert Mugabe. Hopefully, we'll see a situation in the future where there is more democracy, where there is more. I mean, I will praise, for example, Goodluck Jonathan in Nigeria for stepping down because that was a precedent. Nigeria is Africa's most populous country. That sets a healthy precedent. I mean, this shouldn't be something that is. This should just be the norm that a leader serves his term, then he steps down. Now, in other cases where leaders don't have the same sort of personality cult as Robert Mugabe, taking, for example, the president of Burundi, there is widespread public anger. Um, the thing is with strongmen, if it was a case that Mugabe really had improved life in Zimbabwe, then I could, to some extent, understand the excuses for him. But the fact of the matter is, Zimbabwe under Mugabe has been a failed state. Mugabe is not the Kuan Yew, i.e., the late Singaporean leader. He is not a successful leader. All he is an arrogant dictator who has stayed far longer than he should have stayed. Um, And I imagine a lot of his apologists and a lot of hardcore Zimbabweans who support him will say that I'm a wicked colonialist and I don't know what I'm talking about. I should mind my own business, etc., etc., etc. But this isn't about me. Okay, these are my opinions, but I am also speaking out for those Zimbabweans who don't have a voice. I come from a country that cherishes free expression. So long as I have an internet connection, I'm not going to be silenced. I'm not going to sort of not say something because some people might be offended by it, offended by the truth. Um, The truth is pure, and that's all that matters. And there's many Zimbabweans I know for a fact would agree with me, but maybe they're frightened to say so, or they're frightened to speak out, or they're not in a position to do so because dictators are not known for stepping down gently. So Mugabe, to me, is the poster boy for everything that is wrong with the dictator style of government in Africa. Because Zimbabwe hasn't been a success under Mugabe, it's been a failure. This is a fact. Um, there may be other examples where you could quote strong men in African politics where their countries have been more successful. Um, Arguably, Meles Zenawi in Ethiopia improved the economy. And, as with most leaders, you can maybe point out one or two positive aspects. But with Mugabe, I struggle to find many redeeming factors. I really do. Um, and I don't want to just focus on Mugabe here. Idi Amin is another very prominent example. I don't really need to talk in very much detail about that. Um, it is true that there are Ugandans still hold him in very high regard, but ask victims of his regime, ask their sons and daughters what they think of Idi Amin. Ask people whose parents were or grandparents were tortured under his hideous regime, what they think of him. So I basically reject this notion that all Africans think alike, and therefore I reject this idea that perhaps I shouldn't keep saying Pan-Africanist because the term itself is probably not such a simple term. I'm sure there are Pan-Africanists who do want to see better government, less corruption, and more democracy. And for those people, that's a position that I'm very open-minded to. But I also think there are Pan-Africans who just go out of the way to make excuses for the inexcusable, basically. I saw in the extras of The Last King of Scotland there was a Ugandan man who spoke about what had happened to I think it was his father he mentioned, and he made a very good point, and I wholeheartedly agreed with him. He said that every nation has to have an honest assessment about its past. And he was making the point that many Ugandans are now under the age of 20. It's a very, very youthful nation. Many of them haven't even heard of Idi Amin. But that's problematic in the sense that if they haven't heard of him, then they can easily be manipulated into thinking that he was something benevolent. And it would be very, very easy to gloss over the crimes of the likes of Idi Amin. Now, I'm open-minded enough to people who will credit some of these leaders, but only insofar as, only to the extent that they would recognize that some of these men done things that were utterly inexcusable. There are fewer dictatorships in the world today than there have ever been before. That is definitely something to be welcomed. But like I said, the strong man as a role model, this idea needs to be rejected. It doesn't mean you have weak leaders. I'm not talking about having bureaucrats who are unknown and who don't take a leadership role. I mean, look at great leaders like Nelson Mandela. Mandela was the absolute antithesis of what these guys represented, and yet Mandela was also an anti-colonialist figure. So that proves that Africa has a potential to have good government. I mean, one of the great things about Nelson Mandela was precisely because he he didn't outstay his time. He went after 4 years in office, um, and he sought unity in his country. He didn't seek to demonize outsiders. He didn't seek to demonize and divide society the way Mugabe has shamefully done. Um, History is going to record Robert Mugabe as a brutal dictator, and it's entirely his own fault. Um, Mugabe could have been a Mandela type figure. He chose not to be. Um, so history is going to record Mugabe that way. Of course, his apologists will always have excuses, but unfortunately, that is the nature of dictatorship. I'm going to leave it there because I've been talking at length here. I appreciate this video will be controversial. There will be people who agree with me, and I know there'll be people who disagree with me. and they'll probably want to insult me. If people want to have an adult, civilized debate on these matters, I'm all ears. But I stand by my view that um, having a role in the anti-colonialist period doesn't excuse the excesses of these regimes. And another point I'd like to make about outside interference, I understand where that comes from because of the colonial history, but no nation in the world has a right to do anything it wants. Sovereignty for any nation doesn't mean violating basic human rights. And the things that have gone on in the Mugabe regime are utterly reprehensible. That's how I feel about it. You can agree or disagree with me, but I'm the sort of man that speaks my mind. If people feel offended by that, I'm sorry, but that's the way it is. Um, so I really think that Africa has huge potential. I think there is a scope for good government. I think Africa is complex. I think it's got lots of potential, but I really, really hope African countries learn from mistakes by propping up. And to be fair, Western countries have played a role in this in terms of propping up strongmen and dictators. So I'm certainly not taking away our responsibility either, or our culpability, I should say. Um, I'll leave it there. But my message to Zimbabweans who want to make excuses for Mugabe, um, you're letting down your fellow Zimbabweans. It isn't about standing up to the West. Maybe that's what you think it is, but all you're doing is insulting your fellow Zimbabweans who've suffered from this man.